Good evening, everyone. How are you all doing? Hope you all were able to find a seat. Thanks for coming. Dr. Weikart gave this presentation last night in Wahpeton, and we've made it available here in Fargo as well. And I think you know the theme of the influence of Darwinism on the culture of Germany and also our own culture. You know, I mean, Adolf Hitler's gone. World War II is won, but the philosophy that inspired most of that has become a part of our culture in a sense via the view of evolution and Darwinism that we ourselves have, meaning our life is somewhat belittled by the fact that we are dealing with the idea that we came from animals. You know, and so how has that affected us? And Dr. Weikart's going to deal with that, and I just thank you for being here tonight, and let's give him a hand as he comes up.
Okay, thanks for having me here tonight. And as he's already said, I'm going to be talking here about the impacts of Darwinism on the way that we think about the value of human life, and it's a topic that I've dealt with in some of my earlier books, including my recent one, The Death of Humanity, which actually looks at a lot of other secular philosophies too, not just Darwinism, and how they've impacted our thinking about the value of human life. But today we're going to focus on Darwinism, since this is Darwin Week. And so the first thing I need to say, of course, is that Darwinism does not logically entail a support for abortion or euthanasia or these kinds of issues. But we do have to also acknowledge, historically, and I'm a historian, historically, many thinkers have advanced Darwinian arguments to support abortion and euthanasia. And let me just give a couple quick examples before I dive into my topic and show why and how this has taken place. Richard Dawkins, one of the more famous Darwinian biologists in the world today, and of course, one of the most famous atheist proponents today as well, has claimed that the pro-life position is, in his opinion, deeply unevolutionary. That's his actual terminology, deeply unevolutionary. So he claims that Darwinism sanctions abortion, euthanasia. In fact, one time he even said that he hopes that when he is past it, that they will euthanize him. Some of us think already that he's past it, but I don't think. But we're not going to take that into our hands. But Dawkins isn't the only one. There's many other Darwinists over the ages and even today who do make these kinds of arguments promoting abortion and infanticide and euthanasia on the basis of Darwinian arguments. One example is the anthropologist Sarah Hardy, who was at University of California, Davis. As an anthropologist, she was studying primates, and her particular focus of her study was on infanticide among primates. And she argued that primates commit infanticide as an evolutionary strategy, a reproductive strategy. And so she argued that, in fact, we as humans also, since we've evolved, in her vision, from these apes, ape-like creatures, these primates, she claims that we as humans are also what she calls pro-choice mammals. So that's her particular spin too, saying that, okay, that infanticide then has this justification based on the Darwinian struggle for existence. Okay, so what I want to look at tonight then is different features of Darwinism that have contributed to this erosion of the Judeo-Christian sanctity of life ethic over time. And so I'm going to look at a number of different features of Darwinism and its implications. The first one is that Darwinism, properly understood, rejects teleology or purpose. And Darwin himself made this very clear. In fact, there was an American biologist named Asa Gray who corresponded with Darwin, who said, I think we could actually blend these things together, the evolutionary theory and purpose or teleology. And Darwin wouldn't accept that at all. Darwin said, no way. There is no purpose. It's completely by chance processes. And that is pretty much the standard Darwinian argument that's being used today by most Darwinian biologists, that it's completely chance process. There's nothing, there's no purpose toward which it's moving. There's no goal. There's no meaning. And that's very overt in a lot of Darwinian propaganda. So Darwinism then is making the claim that we are the product of millions of copying mistakes. Mutations are supposed to be the basis for the variation and the change that takes place in the Darwinian process, and mutations are copying mistakes. So since there's millions of these copying mistakes that had to take place in order to get from the most primitive organism to humans and the other organisms that we see, this must mean that we are ultimately a colossal mistake. And indeed, many Darwinists have argued that there is no purpose, meaning behind this process. Just to give a couple of examples, in the middle of the 20th century, George Gaylord Simpson, who was one of the more prominent evolutionary biologists at that time, wrote a book called The Meaning of Evolution. And in that book, he said this, quote, "Man is the result of a purposeless and materialistic process that did not have him in mind. He was not planned. He is a state of matter, a form of life, a sort of animal, and a species of the order primates, akin nearly or remotely to all life, and indeed to all that is material." So that pretty much gives you the flavor, and that's a pretty common sentiment among evolutionary biologists, not just in his day in the middle of the 20th century, but today as well. Let me give you a more recent example. Richard Dawkins, once again, one of the more famous evolutionary biologists today. Dawkins stated, quote, "Natural selection, the blind, unconscious, automatic process which Darwin discovered, and which we now know is the explanation for the existence and apparently purposeful form of all life, has no purpose in mind." So he's saying it's apparently purposeful, but there's really no purpose behind it. There's no thing toward which the evolutionary process is moving. And in another place, Dawkins stated, sort of driving this even forward stronger, said, quote, "The universe that we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is, at bottom, no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but pitiless indifference." Okay, so there's no purpose, there's no meaning, there's no design, there's no morality even, according to Dawkins, based on his vision of the evolutionary process. So this first idea here, that there's no purpose, that there's no goal toward which anything moves, does seem to me to be a very powerful force toward devaluing human life, because how can human life have value if there's no purpose behind its origination? And that's pretty much the view that many of these people have taken. The second key point of part of evolutionary thinking and Darwinian thinking that has undermined the value of human life is the idea that humans are nothing more than animals. So because humans have evolved from animals in the Darwinian way of thinking, then there's not this qualitative distinction then. We're just a little bit more of what these other animals have had. Here's a shot showing you, Ernst Haeckel was one of the most famous Darwinian biologists of Germany in the late 19th and early 20th century. And this is a rendition in one of his books of what these missing link would have looked like. So sort of half primate, half human. And so the idea is that there's a continuum. There's no clear breaking point. I mean, there's no point at which an ape gave birth to a human, because they're blurring the distinctions between all of the various species. So they're trying to show there's really not, it's just a continuum. There's no clear gaps between species and also between humans and other kinds of animals. And Darwin even very explicitly argued that there was no qualitative difference between humans and other kinds of animals. Now it's important for him to try to persuade people of his opinion. So that means that we just have a little bit more reason. We have just a little bit more aesthetic sense, a little bit more of moral or social instincts. than other animals do. But Darwin's trying to show that really other animals have these things too, and that we're not really all that different from animals. So one of the ways this gets expressed today is in the animal rights movement, where here's People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, or PETA, one of their placards that they were putting around in cities all throughout the United States and also in Europe and such, called Holocaust on Your Plate. And the idea is that if you're eating chicken, you're doing something just as bad as the Holocaust, because these chickens are being factory farmed and then murdered, by the food processors and such. And so the notion is that there's no distinction. So you see here in the slide, you have the people in the concentration camps, the Nazi concentration camps, people coming out of the Holocaust, and here you have the factory farmed chickens on the other side. So they're equated. It's the same, it's just as bad to do that to chickens as it is to do that to humans on the other side. So again, the notion is that humans are really not much different than animals. This is a book here that makes a similar kind of point of trying to elide the differences between humans and animals as well. This book is by a philosopher. He was a professor at the University of Alabama, Birmingham. He since has passed away. But this book was put out in the early 1990s, called Created from Animals, The Moral Implications of Darwinism. And this book actually had a big impact on my own research, because as I began doing some research on evolutionary ethics in Germany in the late 19th century, I read this book in a seminar I was offering at my university. And the argument that James Rachels makes in this book is that Darwinism undermines the Judeo-Christian sanctity of life ethic. But Rachels thinks that's a good thing. He thinks it's a good thing that we're getting rid of the Judeo-Christian sanctity of life ethic, because he doesn't think that human life is sacred or has any sanctity about it. And so Rachels, in this book, argues that because Darwinism undermines the Judeo-Christian sanctity of life ethic, that therefore abortion, infanticide, and euthanasia are permissible. And so again, he's promoting these ideas about that. And so this book actually caught my attention in my early phases of my own research project relating to this issue, because I noted, when I read that book, I noticed that a lot of his ideas are fairly similar to ideas that I'd encountered in late 19th century Germany. Now, he didn't know that because he was a philosopher. He didn't know his history behind all of this. But I started noticing that people in the euthanasia movement back in the late 19th century in Germany, they're making similar kinds of arguments that Rachels was making. Rachels, of course, didn't know that. Rachels looked at Darwin himself and then sort of jumped to the present and was making a philosophical argument about it. You may not have ever heard of Rachels, but you might have heard of one of his colleagues who is a little bit more famous than Rachels, but holds a very similar position, and that is Peter Singer. Peter Singer has an endowed chair at Princeton University and teaches bioethics there. Singer has put forward a very similar idea that not all human life has value. For Singer believes that some humans' lives have value and some don't. And this idea is sometimes referred to as personhood theory, because the idea is that persons have value, but non-persons don't. And some humans, according to them, are non-persons, because he doesn't think that all human life is sacred or sanctified. In fact, you see that in the title of the book there on the left, Unsanctifying Human Life. And that's exactly what he's trying to do. He wants to unsanctify human life. And in the second book that I have up there, Rethinking Life and Death, the Collapse of Our Traditional Ethics, the traditional ethics that he is looking at the collapse of, in which he wants to collapse, are the Judeo-Christian ideas that human life has value and dignity and moral significance. Peter Singer also, even though he's not written an entire book on the implications of Darwinism for it like Rachels has, he does basically share that same viewpoint. Singer has at various times mentioned the Darwinian underpinnings for his view. At one point, for example, he said that Darwin, quote, gave what ought to have been its final blow, quote closed, to the sanctity of life ethic, to the idea that human life has sanctity. And because of that, Singer does promote infanticide, euthanasia, and also animal rights, because Singer argues that an adult pig has more moral value than a human baby, because he thinks that it has higher levels of consciousness. And that's, by the way, what Singer thinks gives moral significance to any being. He claims it's having consciousness. And I actually challenged him on that point. I debated Singer on a radio show, and I challenged him on his point of why it is that he thought that consciousness gave moral significance to humans. Because Peter Singer believes that this is all that humans and all other species have arisen through chance processes, through the Darwinian processes. And so so consciousness is also just sort of a chance event in the universe and doesn't have any meaning or purpose in any kind of objective kind of way. So I was wondering why it was that he thought that consciousness would be the thing that gives moral significance to humans. And the way I posed the question to him was by saying, look, there are other bioethicists, even within his own camp, who believe in this sort of personhood theory, and I mentioned specifically Joseph Fletcher, who was a famous mid-20th century bioethicist who held this idea that only certain persons have moral value. And I said, Fletcher drew a list of 15 different traits that he thought could confer moral value on humans and make a human a person, whereas other humans would not be persons. And I said, so why do you choose the particular traits that you do? And I was pretty astonished because Singer really didn't have an answer for that. He basically said, well, we can discuss what those traits are. That's open for discussion. We can talk about that. What traits would give moral significance. And that kind of blew me away because that's sort of the basis of his whole theory, is that consciousness is what gives humans value, and if they don't have this certain level of consciousness. And by the way, it's also kind of arbitrary because he never really is willing to state where that level of consciousness is that would actually define, who does have moral significance and who doesn't. So at one point he caught a lot of flack earlier in his career because he did make the comment that he thought it was permissible to kill a baby 1 month or less after birth, right? 1 month old after birth or less. He caught a lot of flack for that, and since that time he's been a little more cagey and won't specify how long he thinks that we should still be able to kill babies, but he certainly does think if they don't have certain characteristics that they don't have moral significance. Okay, so this notion that humans then are nothing more than animals gives rise also to some other key ideas that are going to be important in the devaluing of human life historically. The next one is the rejection of a human soul or spirit. Darwin, again, believed that because humans, he thought, were qualitatively not different than animals, he thought that humans didn't have a distinct soul or spirit that the Judeo-Christian tradition had posited. And so because of that, he didn't think that they had anything special about them in that sense. In Germany, Ernst Haeckel, whom I mentioned, showed you that slide of just a little bit ago, Ernst Haeckel founded in 1906 an organization called the Monist League, and it was called the Monist League because they believed that there's only one substance in the universe, and so there's no distinction between physical and spiritual, or between body and soul, or anything like that in his way of thinking. And this is based that on the idea that everything is just evolved out of animals, and so there can't be any sort of distinct or special soul or spirit to humans. And so that is also going to be a key idea that is going to diminish the value of human life. A fourth key point, in terms of these implications, is the idea that morality is an evolved trait. So morality is biologically determined trait that has come about through evolutionary processes. And what that means is that there's no objective morality, because morality could have been different if the environmental situations we'd encountered had been different, if the mutations had been different that had produced it. We could have different morality. In fact, I was at a conference at San Diego State University on the occasion of the 150th anniversary of Charles Darwin's Origin of Species. This was it was published in 1859, so this was in 2009. And at that conference, there was an evolutionist who got up and said, he said, black widows devour their spouses, the female devours their mate after mating. And he said, it's just a flip of the coin. He did this. It's just a flip of the coin that that's not what we're like. You know, that we don't do that same thing, and that he said, and if it had been the case that we were like that, he said all of our social and moral and political institutions would revolve around that, you know, way of doing things, and for us that would be moral. You know, so killing your spouse after mating would be a moral thing to do if we had come about that way. So it's just, he said, it's a flip of the coin, just a chance event that we're not like that. So morality then doesn't have any kind of objectivity or fixity. It's just changing over time anyway. And in fact, Darwin himself, when in his autobiography, made this very clear that this was his position. He said, in fact, I think I have this on my slide here. Yeah, Darwin said, one can have for his rule of life, as far as I can see, only to follow those impulses and instincts which are the strongest or which seem to him the best ones. Now, Darwin, good Victorian that he was, thought that the strongest instincts were what he called social instincts. And specifically, he even thought that those were instincts that would lead us to love your neighbor as yourself. He specifically mentions the golden rule. He thinks this is ingrained inside of us. And so he has this optimism that, you know, if we just follow our instincts, that, you know, you'll produce something, you know, you'll follow good, you'll follow the loving, you'll do the loving thing or whatever. But if you think about it, warfare, genocide, all manner of evil has been perpetrated by humans over time. And this vision of morality doesn't provide any way of condemning any of those particular things. If Hitler is following his strongest instincts, then, well, you know, he's just following natural law and such. So, or anyone else. I'm not just Hitler, but anyone who's following their instincts. Darwin says, well, that's just all you can do. You know, all we have is nature, so that's all there is in morality. And this is a very powerful idea in our day as well. There's a lot of scientists today and psychologists who believe in evolutionary psychology, or sociobiology as it was being called in the 1970s and thereafter, who believe that morality is just something that has been an evolved trait. E.O. Wilson is one of the most famous evolutionary biologists of the late 20th century and early 21st century. He's still writing things. In 1985, he co-authored an article with Michael Ruse, who's a prominent philosopher of science. And in that article, they said, ethics, as we understand it, is an illusion fobbed off on us by our genes to get us to cooperate. That's a very common idea out there today in the field of evolutionary psychology, which is a major field within psychology. And this is not just at the academe level, but it's also permeating our popular level too. So for example, Robert Wright, who was an evolutionary psychologist himself, he's more a popularizer. He didn't have an academic position or anything like E.O. Wilson or some others. But Robert Wright in Time magazine wrote this article in the mid-1990s in which he argued that adultery is just an evolutionary adaptation. It's just getting your genes in the next generation. It's just a strategy, and if you read much in terms of sociobiology or evolutionary psychology, they use this term constantly, an evolutionary strategy or a reproductive strategy. It's a way of, you know, winning the struggle for existence, essentially. It's a way of getting more of your genes into the next generation, which is what they see everything is all about. It's all about trying to get your genes in the next generation. That's what every organism is trying to do, according to them. And so it's all about somehow sexuality. So there's all sorts of ways that they think that these evolutionary strategies play themselves out in terms of morality as well. Steven Pinker, who is a professor at Harvard University, a psychology professor who embraces evolutionary psychology, in 1997 wrote an article called Why They Kill Their Newborns. And at that time, in 1997, there had been several spectacular cases of infanticide in the United States. One that caught a lot of attention was a young lady who had been at her high school prom. And while she was at the prom, she gave birth to a child and threw it in the trash can in the restroom and returned back to the dance floor. And people, of course, were wringing their hands over this. What are we coming to? You know, how could this kind of thing happen? And so Steven Pinker tried to explain to us how this could happen. It's all about evolution. We've evolved to commit infanticide. And so Steven Pinker argued that in primitive societies and cultures, that because there's such high infant mortality, that people would commit infanticide in order to sort of weed out the weaker, the more sickly, or ones that they didn't think they could take care of well enough to survive. And so Pinker in this article actually said that mothers in these primitive societies would, this was his words, coolly assess the survival value of their newborn infant in order to decide whether to keep them or not. And if they decide not to keep them, of course, they kill them, expose them, and such. And Pinker was saying that, look, this is just ingrained in us biologically, and since biological changes take place very slowly, we still have these things in our psyche of infanticide. So it's all it's all because of evolution that we commit infanticide. Now, Pinker wasn't saying we ought to go ahead and then allow people to commit infanticide necessarily, but it does provide something of a justification for it still in that kind of sense. A fifth key point in terms of implications for devaluing human life is the notion of human inequality. And this is actually, a lot of evolutionists today sort of backpedal on this one, but the whole notion of evolution is the idea that there's variation within species. You have to have variation to get evolution to happen. So when Darwin was writing The Origin of Species in 1859, he was trying to emphasize the variation within species, trying to show there's lots of variety, because natural selection has to be able to select, these certain ones, but there has to be lots of variety taking place in order for evolution to get off the ground. So when they began talking about human evolution, the idea that Darwin put forward, as well as many of his contemporaries, was that there's lots of variation within the human species, and they started then trying to show that there's, huge differences in mental abilities, huge differences in physical abilities, and many of them at the time, Darwin included, as well as many other late 19th century and early 20th century thinkers, believed that there was huge differences in the moral equalities of people that they thought were biologically ingrained. So there was a lot of evolutionists who began arguing that there's all this variety in the humans, and so some humans are superior or fit to use the Darwinian kind of term, or inferior or unfit. And this was going to play into a powerful movement in the late 19th and early 20th century known as the eugenics movement. The eugenics movement was a movement to try to, and maybe to put it kind of crass way, to breed better humans. Maybe to put it in a less crass way, to improve human heredity, to make people better physically and mentally and such. And so here's a shot. The American Eugenics Society began promoting fitter family contests at state and local and county fairs. And so this is the one in Georgia, but this was done in other states across the United States as well. So you show off your best pigs, you show off your best cows, you show off your best sheep, show off your best humans. So here you have fitter families. So you get the best, there and there it is, the fitter families. And the eugenics movement was constantly trying to compare these so-called superior peoples, which could be peoples within societies, could be different racial groups or anything, with those that were considered inferior. A medical professor in Germany who bought into this mentality said this that I think states it pretty strongly, and maybe he's stating it a little stronger than some did, but maybe not too much, because if you read a lot of this eugenics literature, there's a whole lot of talk about superiority, inferiority, and such. But here's what this one medical professor said. He said, quote, "The care for individuals who from birth onwards are useless alike mentally and physically, who for themselves and for their fellow creatures are a burden merely, persons of negative value, is a function altogether useless to humanity and indeed positively injurious." So some of these terms that he used here were actually used quite frequently. Useless, burden. I haven't seen a lot of them use the word negative value like he does, but he even calls it a negative value and such. So this was the kind of mentality that was being produced by a lot of Darwinian thinking at the time of, there's these fit and the unfit, and the fit are going to survive and reproduce, and the unfit won't. And this was applied by many thinkers in two realms. One, within society, and that's where you get like the fitter family contest. That's where you get compulsory sterilization of people that were considered inferior, which was going on in the United States beginning in 1907. Indiana was the first state to pass a compulsory sterilization law. California passed theirs in 1909. Many other states passed it subsequent to that. In fact, most of this, there was a majority of the states in the U.S. had compulsory sterilization laws to try to sort of get rid of the inferior by stopping their reproduction and such. And the U.S. Supreme Court, when the compulsory sterilization laws were brought to the U.S. Supreme Court in the mid-1920s in the Buck versus Bell court case, the Oliver Wendell Holmes, the great American jurist of the early 20th century, wrote the opinion which validated the compulsory sterilization laws and wrote famously, or maybe infamously, 3 generations of imbeciles are enough, and said that the laws that would other public health laws he thought should apply just like the compulsory sterilization rather should apply just like other public health laws could apply. So the eugenics movement was applying this within societies very often, but of course then there's also this inequality, human inequality between societies or between races, as it was very often construed. So I have another shot from Ernst Haeckel's book. It says 1868 there. Actually, this is from the 1870 edition, so that's actually slightly mistaken, unfortunately. I'm sorry about that. But this is from the 1870 edition of his book on human evolution, or just on evolution in general. But this is from the frontispiece, and this looks at 12 different, Haeckel actually called these different species because Haeckel claimed that there were more than one human species. He claims that different humans were divided into species even, not just races. But he claimed that the distance from the highest human, which he thought was this European here, and the lowest human, which he thought was this one here, which I think is a Tasmanian native. I'm not positive of that, but it's any case. So the distance from the highest human to the lowest human, he said, is greater than the distance from the lowest human to the highest primate. And notice how these two look almost alike, by the way, except just for a little bit of hair. So they look very, very close there. And that's purposeful, the way that he drew this diagram here. So the idea is that there's incredible diversity within the humans. Again, so much that Haeckel himself said that there were different human species. At one time he said there's like 10 different human species, completely separated. Darwin didn't go that far, but Darwin did claim that there were significant differences between the species and that some were mentally superior to others, and he did believe that the Europeans were superior to most of the other races that he considered inferior mentally and morally. And he writes about that pretty extensively in The Descent of Man. Darwin also argued that humans were locked in a struggle for existence. Okay, there's all these inequalities, and now these humans are locked in this human struggle for existence. And this was based upon the idea that biological organisms reproduce faster than their food supply. And what that means is that inevitably there's going to be large numbers of deaths take place in various biological populations. And so this is sort of the essence of Darwin's idea of the natural selection, that because there's more produced than can possibly survive, only the ones that are best fitted for their environments are going to survive, and those that are unfit for their environments will not survive and reproduce. And so that's then what produces evolutionary change. So what this means is that there's a struggle for existence going on within each of the species, because they're competing for the same niche. Okay, they're competing for the same food supply. And so Darwin, in his book Descent of Man, makes it very clear that he thought humans also are part of this struggle for existence. And he believed that human reproduction beyond the food supply actually was, in one sense, a good thing, because it would then provide more variation within the species. So this human struggle for existence was carried on within societies, just as we've already suggested. The mortality the more people with more mental abilities and such would, rise to the top and outcompete those who were less intelligent or had less physical capabilities or such. But it also happened between societies, and this is where the racial component comes in once again, which we just talked about in human inequality. Darwin himself wrote to a colleague, quote, that the more civilized so-called Caucasian races have beaten the Turkish hollow in the struggle for existence. Looking to the world at no very distant date, what an endless number of the lower races will have been eliminated by the higher civilized races throughout the world. So Darwin clearly believed that there was going to be certain races that were going to outcompete others, and were going to essentially, ultimately exterminate those other races one way or another. And I didn't mean it necessarily was going to have to take place through warfare. That was one way that it could take place. But it could take place through disease, through spread of disease. It could take place by just economic competition and such. But it could also take place in other kinds of ways. And Darwin actually, by the way, saw that happening in Tasmania, in Australia, in North America. Natives were being displaced by Europeans. Europeans were killing natives, spreading diseases that caused a lot of natives to die, and other kinds of things that were causing them to displace natives in those places. In Descent of Man, Darwin said, quote, at some future period, not very distant as measured by centuries, the civilized races of man will almost certainly exterminate and replace throughout the world the savage races. So that was clearly Darwin's position, that these races were going to exterminate others and displace them over time. And so this notion of the human struggle for existence, I would argue, does produce a devaluing of human life, because it makes death into a positive force, and that's sort of my last point, which sort of links to the sixth point. The last point is that in Darwinism, death becomes a positive thing. In the Judeo-Christian tradition, death is negative. Death is an enemy that's going to be overcome. That's one of the ways that it's described in the New Testament, that death is the final enemy that will be conquered and overcome. It was seen as a result of sin, so again as an evil that was introduced into the world through sin. In the Darwinian understanding of death, death actually becomes a positive force because it's what produces evolutionary progress. And the more death, the better. I mean, the more organisms that reproduce, the more variation. The more variation, the more there can be evolution. But that also means the more death is going to take place, because there's more organisms that get produced that can't survive and reproduce. Darwin expressed this in The Origin of Species, and actually I think I have this on my slide, yes. Darwin in The Origin of Species wrote, thus, from the war of nature, from famine and death, the most exalted object which we are capable of conceiving, namely the production of the higher animals, directly follows. So he's pretty much giving this notion that, death is a positive force. It's bringing about something good, this highest thing that we can conceive of. And many Darwinists embraced then this idea that death was a positive force, and even though many Darwinists such as Darwin were not interested in carrying this out to any further extent, there were some who saw this as a way, there were some who wanted to try to help evolution along, to try to help the evolutionary process proceed. Now, the eugenics movement actually did that in certain kinds of ways, but there actually were others who tried to do this in even more radical fashion. So the eugenics movement did it in this kind of way. So eugenics, in this placard that was put forward, this was at the Second International Congress of Eugenics in New York City in the early 1920s, said eugenics is the self-direction of human evolution. Okay, so they're trying to move evolution along. So let's take evolution in control, and let's help along what we see as the superior ones. This one here was actually a placard that was shown at a lot of county and state fairs by the American Eugenics Society in the early 20th century. And I'm not going to go through the whole thing here, but basically these flashing lights which show that the wrong people are reproducing. The people who have these, what they see as negative traits, inferior people they see as producing too many children, and the people who are educated and, have these superior traits they see as not producing enough children. And so the basic message here is, uh-oh, we're going the wrong direction. We're going to, regret. We're going to regress. Instead of evolving, we're going to devolve. And so we need to do something about this. And the something that they thought they should do about this primarily was compulsory sterilization. That was the big item, although they also sometimes talked about other kind of marriage restrictions and other kinds of things to restrict the reproduction of those that were identified as inferior. Now, there were some people who, in order to try to help the evolutionary process along, decided that they would even thought that they could resort to killing. And actually, Ernst Haeckel, whom I've already talked about a couple of times tonight, Ernst Haeckel was the first person in Germany to propose the killing of those that he considered unfit. In 1870, he proposed infanticide for those infants that were deemed to be physically or mentally disabled. Then in the early 1900s, I think it was 1904 if I recall correctly, he proposed killing adults who had various disabilities. And so the notion of euthanasia, of killing those considered inferior, was an idea that was going to spring out of this milieu of evolutionary thinking at this time. And it was ultimately going to be latched onto by, well, a lot of people, interestingly, and I'm going to show you some other examples in just a little bit. But the person who was going to take it most radically, of course, was Adolf Hitler. Hitler, in a saying that he had that was posted in this 1944 Christmas book, sort of laid out his view of nature. And I've written extensively about Hitler's ideology. I have a book out called Hitler's Ethic. I have a book out called Hitler's Religion, in which I examine Hitler's ideology. And the struggle for existence is central to Hitler's ideology. And this saying here sort of brings that out pretty well here. So Hitler here is saying, all of nature is a violent struggle between power and weakness, an eternal victory of the strong over the weak. And this was the frontispiece of a Christmas book that's not quite Silent Night or, peace on earth, goodwill toward men, that you might expect in a Christmas book there. And by the way, there was nothing about Jesus in that Christmas book either that the Nazis put out in 1944. There's absolutely nothing about Jesus there or religious things at all. It was all about German folk tales and, the Christmas trees and various myths and family time and all sorts of things like that. But here you have, this social Darwinist mentality that Hitler was proposing. And Hitler was going to begin in 1933 a compulsory sterilization program. And here is a slide showing you a poster that was used in German schools. These was used in the German biology classroom in the 1930s to promote compulsory sterilization. In fact, if you read the caption, there was a page of caption that went along with this explaining to the teacher what they were supposed to do with this poster. And the explanation was that they were supposed to justify the compulsory sterilization program by explaining that there's some organisms that are inferior, too weak to survive and such. And so you have then at the top here, the elimination of the sick and weak in nature. That's what it says right there in German. And then at the bottom, this German is translated, whatever does not meet the demands of existence is destroyed. This was actually done in the 1930s, interestingly, before the Nazis actually began killing people with disabilities, which they were going to begin to do later on. But you notice here that the answer is death in both instances here. You have this hare being killed by a raptor. You have this sickly tree being cut down by this man. So in both cases, the answer actually is death that they're projecting there, even though they say it's about compulsory sterilization. The pictures actually take a more radical kind of approach. And indeed, in 1939, once World War II broke out, Hitler did begin a program of killing people with disabilities. In October 1939, he signed a letter, a very short letter, which called for mercy killing, which was code for killing people with disabilities, and set up a program to do that. His personal physician, Karl Brandt, was one of the leading figures in orchestrating that program. They set up 6 killing centers throughout Germany, where they killed people with disabilities. And from January 1940, when they actually opened up the first of the killing centers, until August of 1941, so about a year and a half period, they killed 70,000 Germans with disabilities of various sorts. Many of them were mentally ill. They were all basically people who had been institutionalized. But some were people with congenital blindness, deafness, other kinds of physical and mental disabilities. And in this particular killing center at Hadamar, where I've been, and actually Ben Stein in the movie Expelled, I don't know if any of you have seen that, but he interviewed me at Hadamar, and it doesn't look like that anymore. This is what it looked like right after the war. And by the way, these are not individual graves. They look like individual graves. They're not. These are mass graves. Each one of those is a mass grave because they incinerated the people that they killed there, and then they buried them in these mass graves. But they made them look like individual graves to sort of camouflage the amount of death that actually took place. The amount of death was far more than what you're seeing there on that. In fact, they killed over 10,000 people at Hadamar itself in less than 1 year. And the Nazis didn't have to twist arms. There were a lot of physicians in Germany that were very willing to go along with this program. And I mean, the Nazis, of course, recruited these people who were already willing to do this. But when they got to their 10,000th victim at Hadamar, they celebrated. They threw a party to celebrate the killing. And in fact, there was actually one asylum in southern Germany where even after the Americans liberated the town, they continued the killing. So it's not like the Nazis were twisting people's arms, forcing them to do these things. There were many psychiatrists, physicians, and medical personnel who were gung-ho for this program and very willing to participate in it and just saw this as the opportunity to do it. And sort of they got the green light from the Nazis. If the Nazis hadn't come to power, of course, they probably wouldn't have done it because it had been illegal and they'd been prosecuted. But the Nazis let them do it, and so there were those who were very willing to go along. But we can look at this Nazis, and of course they're the most extreme example of this because Hitler was fanatical about these programs, and he had political power and dictatorial power to, put forward these programs. But the Nazis weren't the only ones who were embracing killing as a means to help evolution. In works that have been done on the euthanasia movement in the United States and in Britain, there's been some good work by historians showing that Darwinism played a very key role in the euthanasia movements in the United States and Britain as well. Ian Dowbiggin has written the best historical book on the euthanasia movement in the United States. He's a professor at Prince Edward Island University in Canada, and he said this in his book: "The most pivotal turning point in the early history of the euthanasia movement was the coming of Darwinism to America." And Nick Kemp, who's written a book about the British euthanasia movement, and Nick Kemp actually is pretty supportive of euthanasia, concurs and says that essentially that Darwinism was a very key component in early euthanasia ideology in Britain as well. So it played a key role not just in setting up Nazi Germany, but also in promoting the idea of euthanasia in the United States and Britain. Here's a quote that may give some of the flavor of some of this from the early 20th century. "There's a place in humanity for murder, that is to say, by killing the unfit." And notice the terminology there, unfit, which was a kind of Darwinian terminology that was being used to describe people that were considered inferior at the time. The next one, "Chloroform unfit children. Show them the same mercy that is shown beasts that are no longer fit to live." Now, these do actually reflect the mentality of people in Nazi Germany, but they were not from Nazi Germany, actually. The first one was by a British progressive sex reformer named Havelock Ellis, who was a very key figure in the eugenics movement in Britain in the early 20th century. And the second one, you may not have heard of Ellis, but the second one you might have heard of, the one that said chloroform unfit children, because that's Clarence Darrow, who was a famous lawyer in early 20th century United States. He was the one at the Scopes trial who defended John Scopes at the famous Scopes trial. He also had quite a number of other famous trials. He was really the most famous trial lawyer of the early 20th century in the United States. These ideas have percolated into the popular consciousness in various ways. And when I show this next thing, I'm not trying to imply that, that Darwinism necessarily ends up in this end point, but it can and it has. I'm not going to back off on it either, even though some Darwinists get upset about this. But Eric Harris, and that picture, by the way, is not actually Eric Harris. That picture is of a film reconstruction of Eric Harris here. Was the person who committed, one of the two that committed the Columbine massacre in Colorado in 1999. Eric Harris was actually wearing a natural selection t-shirt that day when he went in and opened fire at the Columbine High School. And by the way, the day that they did that in 1999 was Hitler's birthday. They specifically chose Hitler's birthday as the day to go in to carry out the Columbine massacre. And he very specifically chose that t-shirt, natural selection, because he wanted to make clear some of the ideology that was behind what he was trying to do there. And if you read, Eric Harris wrote a journal. And I think it's, if I recall correctly, you actually access his journal online if you're interested in reading some of this. But it's really some horrifying stuff. But it does get at his mentality that was behind his desire to commit violence and such. And so, for example, one of the things he said in his journal was, just because your mommy and daddy told you blood and violence is bad, you think it's a law of nature? Wrong. Only science and math are true. Everything, and I mean everything else, is man-made. Okay, so science and math are true. Everything else we've just created, and that includes, of course, morality. And if you read some of the rest of his journal, too, he goes into depth about these things. And he talks extensively about his commitment to evolutionary thinking and such, as well. The person on the right there, you may not have heard of, Pekka Erik Ovinen, was a Finnish young man who killed 8 fellow students in Finland in a shooting at his high school in 2007. And he wrote a manifesto about why he was doing what he was doing. And he talked about how much he loved biological evolution. One of his cyber nicknames was Natural Selector. So again, he sees himself as applying evolution to this particular thing. And in his manifesto, he said, quote, "Humans are just a species among other animals, and world does not exist only for humans. Death and killing is not a tragedy. It happens in nature all the time between all species. Not all human lives are important or worth saving." So the notion is that humanity is not any better or different than other animals. So this is why are we so moralizing about these things? And by the way, that actually is a picture of him that he put into YouTube. He did this YouTube video before he went and shot up the high school. And so that actually is a picture of him, and he's wearing it, that humanity is overrated there on his t-shirt. So that is actually a shot of him from a YouTube video he made himself. Now, of course, most Darwinists are not mass murderers. Most of them are very nice people. I've met, I know lots of people who believe in Darwinism, and know lots of, I've met Darwinian biologists. I've met some of the people I've talked about here. Michael Roos I've met, for example, and talked with him some about his views and different things and such. He's a really nice guy. He's not a mass murderer. He's not going to go shoot up, anyone or anything like that. And a lot of Darwinists cry foul when you raise issues like Columbine or something like that. But on the other hand, interestingly, many of them will admit in certain kinds of ways that they don't think that there's any kind of objective morality or purpose. Like Jerry Coyne, for example, is a great example of this, because Jerry Coyne has on his blog, Jerry Coyne is a professor of evolutionary biology at the University of Chicago. He's actually emeritus now, so he's not actually teaching, but he's retired. But he's still writing a lot, and he blogs a lot. And he gets really upset when people bring up this issue of Columbine and such. But then, on the other hand, Jerry Coyne argues that humans don't have any intrinsic value. So, for example, in one of his YouTube, I think it was off a YouTube video I took this one off of, in quoting him, he said that evolution, he said, challenges some people's religious faith because, and here I'm quoting him, quote, "It strikes them in the idea that they are specially created by God because evolution says you are not." And then he went on to say, "It says that there is no special purpose for your life because it's a naturalistic philosophy. We have no more extrinsic purpose than a squirrel or an armadillo. And it says that morality does not come from God. It's an evolved phenomenon." So I'm not even quite sure why Coyne gets all upset about, the issue about the Columbine massacre anyway, because there are people killing squirrels and armadillos all the time, hunters going out and killing squirrels and armadillos, and Coyne doesn't think we have any more purpose or value than them anyway. But I think somehow he does recognize that human life has value, and that's why he gets upset about the mass killings such as Columbine. And interestingly, even though he says that morality is just an evolved phenomenon and thus doesn't really have any objective significance, in his book Faith versus Fact, Jerry Coyne said, quote, "Indeed, secular morality, which is not twisted by adherence to the supposed commands of a God, is superior to most religious morality." That's kind of an odd kind of statement to make, because if religious morality evolved just like secular morality evolved, they're both just the products of evolution, we all tell this morality based on evolution, what happened evolutionary, then how can one be superior to the other? According to his view, there's no yardstick that you can measure morality by. So how can he say that his secular morality, and that's what he's saying, is that his secular morality is superior to the religious morality of Christians and others that he's opposing and such. So there's some big problems, I think, with his viewpoint there. And I would argue that Jerry Coyne himself, by his view, that humans have no more extrinsic value than armadillos or squirrels, as he said. I believe that contributes to this devaluing of human life and sort of proves my point, so to speak. Now, one more thing that proves my point, I'll wrap this up with this one. Just a couple years ago, in fact, no, just in 2016, John Evans, a sociology professor at the University of California, San Diego, published a study, and I think I have the just jacket of his book there. What is a human? What the answers mean for human rights. And this is a really fascinating book because John Evans is a secularist himself, but he did this sociological survey to try to figure out if people who have religious worldviews have a higher regard for human rights than people that have more secular worldviews. And I think he was actually surprised to find out that people with secular viewpoints do have less regard for human rights, which actually proves my point that I've been making. In fact, Evans actually cites in his introduction where he's talking and laying out what different people have said about these views. He actually does discuss my book From Darwin to Hitler a little bit and talk about how I argue that Darwinism and other secular views undermine human rights and undermine objective morality and such. And he wants to uphold human rights on the basis of some secular worldview, but he finds out that in reality, when he does a sociological survey, that most secularists do not uphold human rights as well as people with religious viewpoints. So in a fascinating way, he sort of underscores the very points that I'm trying to make in this talk and other talks, that these secular viewpoints do undermine notions of the value of human life. Now, Evans actually in the last couple chapters, though, tries to salvage his secular worldview by saying, well, maybe we just need to tweak our worldview just a little bit by trying to emphasize human rights a little bit more and try to sort of save the human rights in some kind of way. It doesn't seem to occur to him that the problem is foundational. The problem is that once you've undermined the idea of there being any kind of deity that could give a foundation for any kind of morality and human rights, that human rights are just hanging in the air. And that there's a reason why then people don't have as much regard for human rights once they embrace secular ideologies. Okay, now, today I've just discussed Darwinism. In my book, Death of Humanity, I actually go and discuss, there we go. My book, Death of Humanity, actually discuss a lot of other secular ideologies and how they also play into devaluing human life. So I'm not trying to make the argument that Darwinism is the only thing, that's producing, abortion, infanticide, euthanasia. That's not my argument at all. But I do see it as a contributing factor. It's one factor among others that have helped produce these secular philosophies that have produced what some people refer to today as our culture of death, in which easy acceptance of abortion, infanticide, and euthanasia are prominent in our culture, especially in the higher levels of academia. Thank you very much for coming out, and I'll entertain some questions now. Question and answer if anyone wants to ask me questions about these issues.
Thank you very much.
Get up there. Whoops.
There we go.
There we go.
Thank you very much. Before we have, I know we have questions. Before we do that, we have a drawing, and I think my assistants will come and help me with this. So we have 3 books. I'll start with the most recent. We're going to give Richard's book away here, The Death of Humanity, and Hitler's Religion, and From Darwin to Hitler. Did I get the sequence right? Most recent.
Almost.
Almost.
Hitler's Religion actually came out last.
Oh, he did, okay. Oh, well. So this will be the first one we're going to give away. And so my assistants here, Adultos, this is Adultos, this is Faith, and they're going to help me. Just randomly choose, don't look.
They're folded anyway, so I don't think
Okay, you can grab one now, that's fine. Okay, Faith, you want to read that?
Jenny Mittleader.
Hey, there you go.
Yeah, there.
You're welcome, you're welcome. And Richard will sign it for you if you like, I'm sure. So next we'll do this one then, and choose again.
Production out right here.
Okay. John. There you go, John. Congratulations. Okay. Last but not least, Hitler's Religion, and we need one more name. A blank.
A blank one.
Now, who put a blank one in there? That's weird. Not very confident, are you? Okay.
Peggy Knotts.
There you go, Peggy. Congratulations. Thank you for participating in that. Thank you guys very much for your help. So we'll entertain some questions at this time. Do anybody have a question for Dr. Weikart? About anything discussed? Yes, let me hand this to you.
Your eighth premise seems a little bit backwards.
Might want to speak in there.
Okay. Your eighth premise about death being a driving force seemed a little backwards to me. That, I don't know, just the idea that the survival of the fittest seems to be like that which breeds the most will overcome into population. Could you elaborate on that?
Okay, so how do you see it being backwards? I mean, I'm not following
Death
how
is
you.
a driving force. Isn't the idea
Okay,
that
okay,
survival
I
of
think
the
I understand your
fittest-
question. Okay, yeah, okay. Well, okay, you're right. It's the only ones that are going to live that are going to reproduce and such. So I suppose it's the living ones that are. But here's why death is the driving force. And by the way, the quotation I gave from Darwin, he actually says that through death and famine and these things, that this is going to produce the higher organisms. But the way it works is this: in order to get as much variation as possible, so that you can get these better variations, you have to reproduce more than the food supply can. More than there can be a food supply for. Okay, so some are inevitably going to die. In fact, one historian of science was talking about this in relation to Darwin. He said that really what you're talking about here is that most of the organisms die. It's not just that you have a small percentage of the organisms dying. It's that really the way that Darwin and the Malthusians of his day construed things. The larger percentage of organisms are going to die. So you only have a very small number that are actually surviving and reproducing. So the way that death drives the process is that the more organisms reproduce, the more are going to die. And so death then weeds out the unfit. But you're right, it's the ones that live that are actually going to reproduce and carry it on. But death is essential to the function. If you didn't have mass death for the other variations, then you would not have the selection take place. So you have to have lots of death in order for there to be the selection. That's what the selection is. The selection is some are dying and some are living. Does that make sense? Okay, I guess I still didn't convince you, but maybe we can talk about it a little more afterwards. Other questions? Yeah.
I think you're ignoring the elephant in the room. It's a lot about economics. In World War I, at the end of the war, Germany was basically broke. And they were looking for a way out. So when Hitler came to power, he gave the Germans, the rich people in Germany, a way to use slave labor and to take people's property in order to prop up their economy again. And the same thing happens in this country. If you can dehumanize a group of people, then you can make slaves out of them, take their land, and do whatever you want to them. And by that, making other people rich.
I don't know that necessarily negates my argument because, in fact, the argument that I'm making deals with a whole host of different movements, including, for instance, the euthanasia movement, which I'm looking. The country did not have a history of euthanasia. Okay, there was.
Yes, it does. They committed genocide on the Native Americans.
Correct.
Enslaved the black man. And they did it because of economic reasons.
That's right.
They couldn't build the wealth of this country without having a ready, cheap labor source that could work in the sun, endure high temperatures.
Sure, there were economic reasons for. Sure, I was not.
And then they rationalized it the same as the Nazis. You see, you talk about him, you got his picture on the book, but it's not him.
Well, the book Hitler's Religion is about Hitler. it's only about Hitler, so of course his name's on the book.
If they didn't find Hitler, they would have found somebody else, probably somebody better looking.
Okay, let's take some of this apart. Yes, there were lots of economic reasons. Obviously, I'm not arguing that slavery, genocide, and warfare and all these things began after 1859. I'm well aware that there's been sin in this world since time immemorial. Okay, so I'm not arguing they began then. But
For a way out, trying to re-exert itself, trying to bring back its glory, and it's doing it by different methods. I think worship, it's more about money than anything else. You can free up women's time so they can go out and do the workforce, create more wealth.
I'm not making a monocausal argument that Darwinism is the only thing that is causing these things to take place. But if you look at those particular bioethical issues that I'm looking at, which include abortion, infanticide, euthanasia, those did not exist, in fact, before the mid-20th. As people were not legitimizing those before the mid-19th century. And when you look at how they began to be legitimized, they were very often using Darwinian arguments from the very beginnings of them. Ernst Haeckel was the first German ever to promote killing babies since.
Another vehicle the human race can use to subjugate other people to achieve economic and social ends. You think, are you a Christian?
Yes.
Well, it's just human nature to raise themselves up, to say that we are better than the rest, to say that because we have wealth, that means we're more creative, smarter. Isn't that the same argument that we use?
But there are ways that, okay, I'm also a historian, okay? And yes, you're right. And I'm not making the argument that sin began with Darwin. That's not even close to my argument. But ideologies make a difference. Ideas do make a difference. I study intellectual history. If you look at the history of communism, you could say, well, okay, and by the way, I talk about communism and the death of humanity. I spend time talking about Lenin and Stalin and their dehumanizing things. I talk about utilitarianism. I talk about materialism. I talk about positivism. I talk about a whole lot of isms. These ideas did make a difference in the way that people treat each other. And they're making a difference today in how we treat each other. And so,
Stalin's, he's probably crazy.
well, Lenin did a lot of horrible things too before Stalin. So it's not just Stalin either.
Lenin and Marx,
Well, I think you and I probably it sounds to me like you and I disagree, because it sounds to me like you're trying to make the argument that the economy determines and drives everything historically. Is that what you're trying to say? I mean, you do seem to be reducing things to...
No, it's basic human
Okay.
nature to make themselves great, to make their country great, to say that they've won, to say that they've been long years, they had enough, they had no money than everybody else.
I would agree with that, but I would also say that ideologies make a difference in how that plays itself out. And in relation to communism, that obviously made a difference. 100 million people died in the 20th century in various communist regimes, not just the Soviet Union. We're talking about Cambodia, we're talking about Eastern European countries, we're talking about China. China had the biggest body count, in fact, of all. So it wasn't just Stalin either. So we're talking about communism as an ideology that was imposed upon people, was destroying people across many countries, wherever it was applied. Well, that would take a huge discussion to get into that. We can talk about that here later, but
Is there anyone
No.
else who has a question on the topic that we were on, about Hitler?
other questions, and I'll be glad to talk to you afterwards more about these things. Oh, thanks.
I want to thank you all for coming. This group that we're involved in on campus is part of the Intelligent Design Fellowship, and some of the rationale that we have for inviting, Richard and others, some of you have been to maybe some of our other events, is that, to your last point there, is it seems like in our culture, postmodern culture, modern culture, science has become the arbiter of truth in our worldview. And science, in our view, has been hijacked by a philosophy which has many names, materialism, Darwinism, whatever. And since it has the stamp of approval of science in our culture, in our consciousness, that affects the only thing that prevented, throughout history, abuse of other people. And that was the idea that in the judgment there would be a reckoning. There is an absolute right and wrong, and no matter what you believe about God, there would be some kind of accountability. Even with Buddhists, I lived in Japan for about 7 years, my wife and I. Even among Buddhist cultures, there is that sense of right and wrong because there is an ultimate something, Science, as we have defined it, falsely, I believe, has taken away that ultimate. And the only ultimate, basically, is chance, necessity, and struggle, mutation, and so on. There's no God, in other words. So the only thing that put a brake on human sin was the focus on the idea there would be an accountability has been taken away. And so this philosophy has affected Nazi Germany, for example, allowed them to do the things that they did. We don't take it that far, but it has affected our view of who we are as human beings. And so these are really, really important issues, especially on college campuses today, because this philosophy, this view of life that goes by science has that legitimate stamp on it and has affected the way people react in our culture to moral issues. It has affected us. And so that's why we have invited, this topic to be here. And your observations are good. It's just that's where we're coming from. And we think it's an important discussion at least, right? Thank you guys for coming very much. Let me just close in prayer as we finish up. Father in heaven, I thank you, Lord, for Dr. Weikart who came to present to us his research. Bless us as we do our own and search our own hearts and our own abilities to understand what truth is, and for those of us who struggle maybe with the possibility that there is an ultimate ground to morality, there's a God, a creator, help us, Lord, to see that possibility and make it real for us, because that's the only foundation that we really have as human beings, ultimately. We thank you in Jesus' name, amen. Thank you all for coming. And if you want to talk to Dr. Weikart about some particulars, we're around, so.